You've learnt words, you've studied words, but you don't remember them when you need them and you don't recognize them when you hear them. We all struggle with this. All right, welcome back to the Story Learning Podcast. Today we've got a question that is going to strike to the heart of every single language learner listening to this podcast right now. So I'm just going to get straight into it. It is from Flashlife8256. And Flashlife8256 said, "Hi Ollie." He's very polite. "I've been having trouble remembering vocabulary." Yes, see, I told you. "I've been having trouble remembering vocabulary, especially when trying to recall it in speaking. Not only that, I've had words that I've learned before and I 100% know, but I find myself struggling for the meaning in a sentence. Do you have any tips to rectify this problem? It is very frustrating." And Flashlife8256 speaks Chinese to an intermediate level. Right, so let's put it plainly. You've learnt words, you've studied words, but you don't remember them when you need them and you don't recognize them when you hear them. Right? We all struggle with this. This is nothing new. And what this comes down to is the difference between recognition and recall. Right, just let those words sink in for a second. It's a big deal. Recognition versus recall. Recognition is when you hear it and you can understand it. Recall is when there's a word that you need to use and you need to retrieve it from your memory and then say it all without slowing down in the sentence. Okay? Two different things, recognition and recall. Now, at the heart of every single traditional method to learn a language is a root failure to get to grips with this basic problem of the difference between recognition and recall. In textbooks, in courses, in classes, whatever, they will just give you words and say, okay, go and learn those words, and when you've learned those words, then you know them. Problem over, right? Job done. Except we know, as language learners who actually use languages in the real world, we know that that's not how it happens. You can learn a word and then forget it. You might have seen the forgetting curve before. It shows that you have to learn a word multiple times, and every time you learn a word, it sticks for a little bit longer in your memory, right? So the reality that we're faced with is that when we are learning words, they don't stick the way that we want, and we have to learn it over and over again, usually in lots of different contexts before one day we actually remember it. Right, so Flashlife8256, the first thing I want you to know is that this is completely normal, and what we need is a strategy, and this is where some active learning can really help. I teach languages through stories, right, through reading, and I think that is the most effective approach to learning a language, because simply when you're reading a book, you cover so much territory that your brain has enough exposure to then learn properly, but it's not enough. And some active learning is always there. I mean, I have always been an advocate of active learning. The problem is that it has to be in combination. And what we're really looking for here is to understand how we learn best. And I can tell you that for me personally, the way that I learn best is by spending about 80% at least of my time on input through reading, watching movies, having conversations and stuff like that. Because remember, in a conversation, you're also getting lots of input, right? And then about 20% of the time actually practicing some kind of active techniques, in particular, active recall. So we'll get onto that in a second. Now, there is a lexicographer and star of a program called Countdown, which UK listeners may be aware of. Susie Dent is her name. And she estimates that native speakers have an active vocabulary of about 20,000 words. That's active, right? 20,000 words. And a passive vocabulary of 40,000 words. So what this means in practice is that you will be able to recognize 40,000 words that are used, meaning that you hear the word in the sentence and you know what it means, but you're only going to be able to actively use 20,000, meaning you're only going to be able to recall and use about 20,000. So we can recognize twice the number of words that we can actually actively use. And recall is harder for the brain than recognition because there aren't as many cues, and it's cues that activate related memories. So for example, when you are listening to someone or when you're watching a movie, there are all these cues going on in the dialogue, in the conversation, and those cues can help you understand what the meaning of a particular word. But if you're the one that's speaking, then you're kind of having to create your own cues to remember this word and then use it. So it's just a lot harder. And that is in your native language. So imagine doing that in a foreign language. It's many times harder because we don't have all of these cues that we would have in our native language. We don't have a whole lifetime of experience of contextual vocabulary. So what I find is that when I want to when I want to intentionally improve my vocabulary in a language, what I need to do is actually practice actively recalling, or I suppose I should say, I try to actively practice recalling vocabulary. And what I'm specifically trying to do is I'm trying to practice conversations in advance. Because I know that if I've just learned a word from a book of short stories, for example, I know that when I'm in the middle of a conversation, it's fast-paced on strange topics, I'm not going to remember that word that I've just learned from those stories. And so I want to actively practice bringing it back. Now, there are 3 ways that I do this. First of all, I use reverse flashcards. Now, I'm a fan of flashcards for practicing very high-value vocabulary. Right, so when I'm reading, what I tend to do is underline words that I want to remember, and I'll put them into my flashcards later. Now, what a lot of people do with flashcards is they display the word in the target language first, and they ask themselves, okay, well, what does this mean? But what you're doing there is you're practicing recognition. So you're showing yourself the word, and you're asking yourself, okay, what does this mean in English? But that's not helping you recall that word. That's just helping you recognize it. So what I do with my flashcards is I display the word in English, and I say, right, how do you say this word, Ollie, in Japanese or French or Norwegian or whatever? And then I will force myself to recall it. Because that's what happens in a conversation, right? In a conversation, you're like, okay, I need the word for chestnut. What's that word? What's that word? What's that word? And you start racking your brains, and then eventually it comes to you, and you can use it. So we want to try and mimic that process. So with flashcards, you display the English word and say, right, chestnut. Okay, how do I say chestnut in Norwegian? It's getting pretty random. By the way, I have no idea how to say chestnut in Norwegian, just in case you were wondering. But I display the English word, and I'm thinking, okay, how do I say this word? And then I'm actively practicing the recall. Okay. Now this is very manual. You can't do this with thousands of words, but if you deliberately do it with words you really want to remember, it's just a very good way of doing it. The next thing I do is that in conversations themselves, whenever I'm having a conversation in a language with somebody, I actually have a habit of bringing into this conversation, and this is with a tutor, right? This is not real. I'm not doing this in the street, but I might do it on italki, for example. I would actually prepare a list of 5 to 10 words before the session that I want to actively try using. And I will then give that list to my teacher and say, look, I want to practice this list of words today. And so then we will quite artificially just find excuses to actually inject these 5 or 10 words into the conversation. But guess what? It works. Because now, by the end of the session, we've had a whole hour speaking about, like, I don't know, chestnuts and stuff. But I'm never gonna forget that word chestnut in Norwegian after that session, because we've deliberately done it. Now, the third thing that I really like to do is what is known as reverse translation. Now, reverse translation is a great technique. It's one of the hardest but most powerful language learning techniques, where you take a text, a short text in the target language, you translate that into English yourself, then you cover up the original, and then you translate it back from English into the target language. Now, why does this work? It works because you are now working from the English, and you have to recall how to say that thing in the target language. So again, we're practicing active recall. This is great for grammar, this particular technique, but it's also really good for vocabulary. So if you have a passage in a book which contains lots of vocabulary that you're interested in, and you've spent some time trying to learn that vocabulary, you can do this reverse translation exercise, and it's going to help you not only recall those words that you want to use, but also how to actually use them in context, which again makes it a lot stronger. So what I'm talking about really here is actually taking active steps to remember vocabulary, because although active learning is no panacea, it really can help just make your overall learning more efficient. And the reason it's not a panacea is because, see, most people, they spend all their time doing active learning, like trying to memorize stuff, doing practice exercises. The problem with this is there's just too much to learn in a language. There's too much. And so if you spend all your time doing active exercises, you're never going to cover enough ground to actually learn. So what we want to do is flip that on its head, spend most of our time actually getting input and using the language, immersing ourselves in the language, which is the whole basis of the story learning method, right? But then on top of that, then we want to spend 20% of our time actually actively learning, because then we're fusing it and we're getting the best of both worlds. But we're still spending the majority of our time actually getting input so that our brain can do its whole passively soaking up by osmosis thing, which is extremely good at. Anyway, if you would like a bit of support in learning more vocabulary and grammar, then at StoryLearning we have the Grammar and Vocabulary Study Sheet. we have amazing names for these things. They are the most descriptive things ever. This one does exactly what it says on the tin, grammar and vocabulary study sheet. And what this helps you to do is to be selective about the vocabulary and the grammar that you want to learn, right? We're not trying to learn everything in your textbook or everything in one of my storybooks. We are trying to take the 80-20 approach of saying, right, 80% of this stuff, I don't need this now. I just need the 20%, thank you very much. And then this worksheet is going to help you actually select what that is, write it down, and then it's going to give you a focus for your study. If you'd like a copy of the beautifully named grammar and vocabulary study sheet, you can see a link in the description or a QR code on the screen, and you can scan, and that will give you a copy of that. It's completely free. I hope you enjoy it. I hope you find it useful. And FlashLife8256, thank you very much. I hope this helps you with your vocabulary recall in some small way. Thank you very much, and I'll see you back in the next episode of the podcast.